So let me introduce these two wonderful speakers, one of whom is a member of our parish, Dr. Andy Selak, both of whom graduated from the best Catholic theological program operating in the United States right now. And the fact that I also did my PhD at Boston College means that I'm still an unbiased observer of this. But both graduates of Boston College. Dr. Selak works these days as the Associate Director of the Women's Center at Georgetown University. So she wrote a PhD that she defended just last year during pandemic. I remember it was on Zoom and I was able to go for some of it, on using trauma theory to talk about the church as wounded and thinking through the woundedness of the Catholic Church through the lens of trauma theory. She's also a member of the parish and is just in Georgetown a lot these days for her job as well. Dr. Nichole Flores is assistant professor at the University of Virginia. You may have seen both Dr. Selak and Dr. Flores' writing in Commonweal, in America, in various ways in which they are public theologians bringing their conversations outside of academia to the rest of us who need to hear what they're doing as well. But in her research area, Dr. Flores does work on Latinx theologies, on justice, on issues of the intersection between aesthetics, ethics, and theological reflection. She has a book coming out in just a few months now that I'll put into the thing from Georgetown Press on the aesthetics of solidarity, Our Lady of Guadalupe and American democracy. So that's very exciting to know that that has a date. And what today, Dr. Selak, Annie is going to be sort of leading our conversation and asking Nichole some questions and talking a little bit between the two of them. And then we'll open up to have a wider conversation with everyone who's here on this call. Feel free to text me directly using the chat function if there's something going wrong, if you can't hear somebody, if you have an immediate logistical issue, and we'll go from there. So first of all, on behalf of Holy Trinity Parish, we're so grateful to Dr. Selak and Dr. Flores for being with us today. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today at our parish, Nichole. I think I'm really excited to be able to hear about your experience, and then also to help us think through critically, how can we start becoming an anti-racist parish, right? How can we embrace this? So I want to start out with context, right? We start theology from context, right? But just thinking, coming to this conversation today, right, we're going to be talking about anti-racism. But while racism and white supremacy are certainly always part of the context of the US, this week feels heavier, right? So this week has been filled with news about police violence, about white supremacy, about the killing of Black men and teenagers and a Mexican-American child. How are you doing? Like, how are you coming to this conversation? How are you doing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And I only wish I could be there in person. It's one of my favorite drives, and it was one of the last drives I took right before the pandemic. And I just can't wait to be able to get up there again. So maybe in the future there's an embodied visit, even if I'm just sitting in the pews with y'all. So there's that. And of course, the very first step to becoming an anti-racist parish is wanting that, giving the will and object, as our Thomist friends would say. But to your question, Annie, yeah, I don't even have words at this point for speaking about the depth of anger and sadness and frustration that I feel. And I think those of us who are parents, and I think particularly those of us who are mothers, like you and I, have had a very interesting theme to reflect upon theologically, given to us by George Floyd. And of course, this was something that was, very, very public at the time of his death, but with the trial and the airing and the re-airing of the video of his execution, listening to his cries for his mom, And, I think for every parent that should, you know, unless we've closed ourselves off to that kind of maternal, paternal, parental love, I don't know how you hear that and don't hear, we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble. Regardless of our own racial and cultural backgrounds, in that we should hear a call to action and certainly a call to mourning. But I think as Catholics, that cry has, and as a Catholic, for me, I don't want to speak for all Catholics, but for me as a Catholic, that cry has resonated. I think it's I'm always thinking about those who've been left behind, and especially the parents and the families, but like really, especially the moms, especially now that I have my own kiddo, and he's 3 and he's rambunctious, and he's half Mexican American like me and half Canadian like my husband, but he had slightly darker skin than everybody around here, and he's an energetic kid. And I imagine that socioeconomic privilege will shield him from some of the more negative effects of this violence, but I'm not entirely sure. So some of that is, just this real dread, almost counting down to the time when he's no longer considered a child, but an aggressor. And I think that has really stunned me with the case with Adam Toledo, as with everyone I've seen commentate on it, even if people are hired to be a legal talking head and to analyze the case from the perspective of police policies and protocol stuff. I haven't heard anybody who hasn't been deeply disturbed by that, and that's kind of where I find myself this week, is back in that parent's heart space and not sure how to say everything that is in that space right now or express it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really stands out to me how you said, how do we mourn? How do we express anger, right? Like, what are your thoughts on the role of the church in this, right? Because this isn't just something we're reading in the news, right? There's a response of the church. And I think sometimes we see that response. Sometimes the church models that well, and sometimes that the church leaves us wanting for that prophetic voice. So what are your thoughts on how should the church be responding to this epidemic of police violence and killings and white supremacy, and what we're just seeing all around? What is the role of the church in this?
Mm-hmm. Well, one theologian whom I really deeply admire, who's helped me learn a lot about this issue, both personally and theologically, is Brian Massengale. And his call for all of us to begin from a place of lament, I think, is something I see in certain corners of our Catholic Church in the United States. I think that the bishops and the parishes and the particular Catholics who are responding best to this crisis and this culture of death are the ones who recognize that just saying, or even just asking, was he obeying the law? That's not an innocent question. And beginning with, oh my God, how long ago, God, how long ago, God, that's the place to begin. And I think there's a theological temptation from some corners of our church, maybe every corner of our church, maybe even every human heart, to ask, well, what does the law say? Without putting in context that Jesus Christ is our law, and not just in a very simplistic way, don't have premarital sex, or or even just to be less glib, the 10 Commandments and, you know, the word of the gospel that they get. So there is instruction and guidance for how we live, but that these questions, especially as they pertain to children and young people, but I think to every person, just saying, you know, this response of, well, he should have been obeying the law or this would not have happened, I think is extremely counterproductive. And also seems to indict Black culture, Latino cultures for somehow not instilling in our children that we should value law or that we teach our children how to act, or and also in a time when, as you know, I don't want to assume for everyone, but I know a lot of people around me know people who have been deeply uh, affected by addiction and trauma and and other forms of grief and strife that do affect how we act in the world. And the church as pastor and as offering mercy and a balm, I think that merciful heart of the church really needs to be leading our response to this. And I don't want to, you know, I love the church. I think this is why I get some airplay in like America Magazine, because I love the church. I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm not Catholic anymore or anything like that. And I do see places where even in, you know, churches that perhaps haven't reached a point where they have said, yes, we want to be an anti-racist church. I would count my own parish as, you know, among these numbers of kind of places where people are deeply disturbed by what's going on, but don't have like really the best resources for responding to what's going on. But I have seen these glimpses of, you know, of the merciful heart and the kind of merciful posture that Pope Francis has he's used this as an entire theme for his papacy, and it's a guiding virtue for our church right now. And I think it's along with lament the appropriate one for framing the current crisis, rather than how do we make sure that young Black men, young brown men follow US law as currently written in order, you know, for this to stop, I think is uh, a both ineffective and unmerciful response that I've seen from some corners of our church.
Yeah, yeah, I think that framing it in lament and framing it in mercy together, right? Because those go together, and I think there's a lot to that. So I'm struck by the sense, you know, you said like with quite joy, like I love the church, right? Like the church is part of you and you are part of the church. And you know, you've been talking about your role as a parent. And we have children about the same age. They're within a few months of together. So social media has allowed us to kind of see each other's parenting journey in parallel. And I'm struck by when we made the decision to baptize Frankie, that felt like a big decision. In one way, it felt like not a big decision because it's what we do as Catholics. And in another way, so when I joined Holy Trinity, when we moved to DC, it was when all the revelations of McCarrick were coming out, right? And part of the reason we chose Holy Trinity was because when we attended Mass there, it was directly addressed, right? Like the preaching, the announcements, the parish, like were directly addressing the lament and the injustice. But I'm curious about your own decision to baptize your child, especially in a church that you deeply love, but also in a church that sometimes makes us grieve, right? In a church whose silence around issues of racism or other, I mean, there's so many areas where the churches can be deafeningly silent. So tell me about that decision and kind of what's at play in there.
Yeah, so I've written a little bit about this publicly in a very short essay on it, but I've kind of been on a journey with my current parish. It's not the parish that makes Here's some context. Charlottesville, we have actually a pretty healthy Catholic community, but not a ton of parishes. We have 3 main parishes, one kind of in the downtown area, about a block away from the park where the Unite the Right rallies happened in August 2017. So there's a Catholic parish kind of across the street, actually from a Jewish synagogue in the downtown area. And then there is a parish that is closer to the highway. Actually, it's on our way to Washington, D.C. And it was founded kind of as a mission parish when that was a suburban area of the town, but now that it's a part of the town, it actually has a really thriving Latino ministry. So it's kind of a catch-all for people. It's really received the Second Vatican Council better than the other parishes, and it has a very special mission for Latino parishioners. So we used to go there, and it used to be very close to where we went, but the University Parish is a Dominican parish, and they sensed right away that I'd been educated by Jesuits. So some of my interaction with this parish has kind of been the tensions that exist between Dominicans and Jesuits, but also between, Catholics who really, have one interpretation of the Second Vatican Council and the others, and others who have a different one. All of these subtle tensions have been present. But I also just can't walk away from this parish. In part because in August of 2017, in the lead up to the rally, not the aftermath of the Unite the Right rally, but before that rally, this was the only parish in town that did anything. And it wasn't perfect. What they had, which was very true to their charism and their devotion, it's a very traditional parish, they had a rosary. And they prayed for racial justice, and they had opportunities for confession for sins of a racial nature. And perhaps the framing, if I had been in charge, I would have put in some structural references there. Not all racism is personal, but yeah, some of it, yes, it certainly can be, but I would have had some more about structures. But that they did anything at all, I keep coming back to that. And every time when there's a homily about natural law that I'm like, have you even read Thomas on the Natural Law? And those tensions kind of crop up again. I keep coming back to that moment of goodwill where I was like, do you know what? When the chips are down, when Nazis, self-proclaimed Nazis, and I know that your community now knows this pain very well, when they say we're coming and we're going to your town, what is a parish going to do? Are they going to pretend that nothing's going to happen and pretend? And this is what the parish, kind of the more well-received Vatican II parish was doing. They're like, just ignore them and they'll go away. That wasn't what was going to happen. This parish seemed to have a better understanding that we can't wish sin away. We can't make it go away. We can pray and we can act, but we can't, just imagine a different world and independent of our actions, just make the truth different. And I think that's where we've been able to kind of align, is that we both believe that there's a truth. So all of that background to say, when it came time to baptize our kiddo, we were a little bit late because we had planned on doing it at home where I'm from in Colorado, and then the pandemic happened, and then we're like, oh, we'll just wait until after the pandemic, and we would still be waiting if we'd kept on waiting. But we decided that yes, this parish is where we want him to be raised, not because everybody's always going to agree with him, but because when that completely terrifying time was happening, they did nothing. They did something rather than nothing. And that meant a lot in terms of the joy, kind of giving us joy in that sacrament. Even if, we, of course, as parishioners, want to continue to influence the parish to be more bold and to even, make a declaration like we want to be an anti-racist parish. That's not something I've ever heard, from anyone there, but maybe that's a part of the future, and it's a process, and it's a process that requires that love and commitment. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a roundabout way and a lot of backstory, but a part of our decision in doing that was, yes, it's the thing that Catholics do. We want our son to be raised Catholic, but in this particular parish at this particular time in history, that it was really important for us to baptize him in a parish that we knew to have that kind of awareness.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I mean, I like started writing down some of what you were saying, right? Because there's so much that stands out to me about like, we can't wish sin away. We like something rather than nothing, right? We can't wish sin away. I think there's something deeply theological and true about that. Yeah. So you talked about Charlottesville and that experience and that. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of dive more into that. So Charlottesville has kind of become, for a lot of people, this like it has come to symbolize the tensions of race and the Unite the Right rally and that. But for us, Charlottesville is a short drive away, right? But for you, it's home. Or your home, where your home is now, probably I'm guessing one of many homes. What can you tell us about that experience of being in Charlottesville in 2017?
Yeah. Well, it is funny because we've been here. So I had a parental clock pause, and if I'm going up for tenure, does that mean I'm going on 6 years here? It feels like a lifetime, in part because so much has happened while we've lived here, and it really does feel like home. We bought a house. We've kind of put down roots here, which has been a joyful experience, but it's been in the midst of this time of trial, and so a couple of things stand out to me about Charlottesville in 2017 and kind of living here. The first is that the story and the background of how Catholics in particular were involved. Actually, I kind of want to write a book about about this, or perhaps co-write it with.
Please do. Yes.
Well, and there's another theologian theologian activist who really puts his activism kind of like he wears it on his sleeve, named Eric Martin, who's a dear friend of mine, who is really one of the Catholics who was leading on the ground and kind of showing the possibilities of the Catholic faith in the pursuit of justice in the face of violence and hatred and betrayal. So there was that part of the story, and I think it's important to name that part of the story, that before I say what I'm about to say, that not just my friend Eric Martin and our friend Eric Martin, but local Catholics, especially those connected with our Catholic worker community. I failed to mention them along with the parishes. They're kind of like a catch-all. And actually they've done a really good job of cultivating a community, not just of, people who love social justice, but they've been a really inviting community for bringing Catholics of all kind of backgrounds together in our city. And they're just an incredible place and incredible people who run that community. But they did a really great job of mobilizing lay Catholics, getting people out there. And it wasn't just people, the very brave people standing on the front lines and engaged in peaceful nonviolent direct action, but there were Catholics handing out waters and checking on people and doing triage once the violence had occurred of that day. Catholics involved in lots of different ways. But the thing that stands out to me most, I guess it's twofold. The first is that the entire summer leading up to that moment, that what happened in Charlottesville wasn't a singular moment. It wasn't just like some people decided to like march on Charlottesville on the morning of August 10th, and by August 12th they'd done what they were going to do. We knew they were coming, and the community had been trying to figure out how to organize to this for an entire summer. And I personally felt like I was jumping up and down on social media saying, hey, we need help here. We need help. Mayday, mayday, help, help, help. And everybody's like, oh, racism is bad. And we're like, no, we need clergy. We need people in collars to show up here. We need we know that you can get in your, shared car from your little Jesuit community in Boston or wherever in Georgetown and drive here. We need you here. We need you here now. And we got nothing. As a matter of fact, zero Catholic clergy. Gets very upset thinking about this. Zero Catholic clergy showed up and were engaged either in the on the ground kind of less direct help, but certainly not in the nonviolent direct action. And it wasn't because there wasn't information. There was a nationwide call, a Mayday call from Charlottesville saying, we need you here. And every time somebody talks about Charlottesville among theologians, among ordained people, I get really upset because it doesn't begin with a confession. I don't care how liberal you are or how much you claim to be committed to racial justice. It should begin with a confession. If you knew and you didn't show up, or you didn't say you didn't send out that signal, you didn't boost the signal and say, hey, we need people there. Maybe I personally can't go, but we need people here. That needs to be named and said. And for my part, and it's so funny because there's not a single person I talk to in Charlottesville who doesn't feel like they should have done more. So I had found out before the rally about 3 weeks beforehand that I was expecting, that I was pregnant with a child, and thus we made the decision that it was best for us at the time to be supportive in other ways that didn't involve me being dehydrated on the ground. I wasn't going to do the the nonviolent direct action, but we needed to be involved in a different way. But it was a decision. It was a prayerful decision made in consultation with other people there, but we feel guilty about that. But then I know people who showed up and were just, helping others out who were injured, who were like, oh, I should have done more. And then the people who were on the line, having guns pointed at them saying, I should have done more. But I noticed that people who weren't here never say that. And I think that, or maybe not never, but, maybe it's a thought that doesn't occur to people that, the network of people who were trying to reach out to them, that there's a deep hurt, from the church in Charlottesville to every Catholic leader who might have shown up when, we had lots of Protestant leaders who did show up. And then, for, I guess the second part of this is in our own Catholic community here, even though my current parish, they had a prayer, they had the rosary and they prayed in advance. Nobody showed up. Nobody showed up from the parish that has well received the Second Vatican Council, and nobody showed up from the parish that is the neighbor to the Jewish synagogue that was directly targeted and threatened with violence, not just guns, but bombs, every kind of violence that you can imagine. They didn't show up at all. Now, I've since heard that the pastor, he's Nigerian and he goes home to Nigeria every August. That makes sense to me, but that there wasn't an organized presence, that parish didn't do everything it could to shield and defend its Jewish neighbors, knowing what we do about the history of Jewish Catholic relations is really deeply disturbing to me. So I think the thesis of all of this kind of emoting and thinking out loud is that we needed everyone to show up, and very few people showed up, both locally and in broader networks, in ways really small, whether it was just, sending money or sending prayers or making sure that people knew about this in advance. It took everybody by surprise. It really shouldn't have. We'd been saying our house is on fire, as my friend Jelaine likes to say, another Catholic who's very much involved with the organized response to this. Our house is on fire. We need your help. We need your help. So maybe a vision of church where the Catholics in Charlottesville aren't just out here by ourselves, or the Catholics in DC are not just, you're not just there by yourselves, that we're connected to each other. And when we need each other's presence, there's a way of calling upon each other and being in solidarity with each other when the chips are down.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think I invite my fellow parishioners on this call who are white. I know not everyone on this call is, but to think of like your own response and how sometimes like whiteness can be impacted in that. So for instance, for myself, like one of the things that's been really helpful for me to learn about whiteness is that it has this like desire for perfection, right? So if I'm like an anti-racist, I have to be a perfect anti-racist. And if I'm not, I need to tell people why, right? So even in myself, I'm like, here are the reasons I didn't go to Charlottesville. And that's just not helpful, right? Like that, but it's very helpful for me to recognize how whiteness is impacting my reaction, right? So I just invite others to like, as you're listening to this, to like take stock of what you're feeling, and then like maybe later, maybe with a spiritual director or in a community, right, to process those as well, because I think that's an important part in hearing this, and hearing the call to solidarity, right? Like that's also what I hear in this, of like, what does solidarity look like within the church, and beyond the church as well? Like how does that function? Now there's another question kind of that I want to raise about anti-racism, but I want to preface it, right? So we're gathered today kind of in this series to talk about being an anti-racist parish, and that anti-racism is often thought about in black and white terms, right? And I think it's important to name the reality of anti-blackness, that anti-blackness is absolutely real. I also want to name that racism isn't exclusive to black-white divisions, right? So I want to, I guess, open up space if you want to talk about your experiences of racism as a Latina in the Catholic Church. But here's the caveat I want to put on it. I also think there's a one of the actions of whiteness is to expect other people to parade their trauma for us. And I don't want to do that, right? I feel like I'm trying to navigate this tension of wanting to make space for a predominantly white parish, not exclusively, but predominantly white parish, to like receive like other people's experiences and to think about the ways that racism impacts everything, but also not asking you to like, parade trauma for us, because I don't think that's fair to you. So however you want to respond to that question.
I love that framing. It's so generous and hospitable, and aware. Well, and like so many of my stories and experiences of the Catholic Church, this one begins with happiness and joy. I grew up in a parish it's on the west side of Denver. We were majority Mexican American, and then we had a small sliver of a white contingent, but then the next largest group in the parish was Vietnamese. So we had a really, dynamic relationship between the Mexican and Vietnamese Catholics in the community, and a lot of sharing that took place just because we were sharing the same parish. Now it was complicated because there was English speaking masses and Spanish ones and Vietnamese masses, and so we weren't always in the same place at the same time. But in addition to sharing the parish, we shared the neighborhoods, we shared the schools, and there was just so much rich interaction. So my earliest memories are just of like, telling my Vietnamese friends about like what it was like to love Guadalupe. Like they're very good. I think, though, even in those earliest moments of my faith formation, just really aware that, and I don't think this is particular to the Archdiocese of Denver, although I'm not a huge fan of how they've done intercultural interactions there, but there's a sense that both Mexican American culture and Vietnamese culture were inferior to white culture. And I should give, credit where credit's due. The Archdiocese of Denver has been really, has always really advocated for immigrant justice. They have a center for Latino ministry called the Juan Diego Center in Denver. So that they've done some important stuff. So I'm not going to say that they've done nothing, but it always seems to be done from the context of we're trying to correct, this bad culture that you have that keeps you from being the kind of Catholics that we think you need to be, rather than kind of a willingness and an openness to receive the beauty of these particular traditions. And in Denver, beyond just my little parish, we have also Black Catholics, and we have Catholics from a range of different backgrounds and cultures, but those were not really received well or at all, in kind of in that move of solidarity, to the point where, as the Archdiocese has had to face really challenging decisions about which parishes remain open and which ones are closed, almost without exception, it's the Latino parishes that are closing. And again, I don't want to be Pollyannish and like, oh, every parish can remain open. Like, I know that dioceses are under extraordinary financial pressures, a reduction of resources. The pandemic is going to make this worse for people. But of course, the justice question emerges: who's bearing the burden of that, and what are the outcomes of that? And I think that's a part of that decision. It comes from a place of like not thinking that our Catholicism is actually equal or or really bringing as much to our common faith as white Catholic culture, which I think it's of course that's a nonsensical thing to say. Of course, white Catholics come from a range of different backgrounds and ethnicities and experiences, and all I would never say like, oh, and those experiences are not worth preserving. Of course they are, but thinking about why is it that if you look at the Archdiocese of Chicago, the first parishes to close there are the Black Catholic parishes. Even though we live in this time where there's a tremendous need for neighborhood institutions to anchor the communities that are struggling with gun violence, that are struggling with poverty, and that we all know from our own experiences of a loving parish that a really wonderful parish can ground a community in a very specific and needed way, and that Black and Brown communities need that more than ever, and we need those parishes. So I think it's my experience of the tension has largely been in that difference. Now, as a Catholic theologian, I've had others that are not as relevant to this this conversation here, but I think as a Catholic in the pews, as a lay Catholic, that constant sense of being devalued and really the a pressure to become more like white Catholics in the United States has been my my most disappointing experience of as a Latina in the church, I should say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So the last question that I want to pose before we open it up is, what suggestions do you have for us, right? So we are naming that like we want to be an anti-racist parish, a parish that is inclusive and is actively anti-racist. What suggestions, what advice, right? You have a Zoom call of people who like are here from 4 to 5 on a Sunday afternoon. Either what advice do you have for us, or what things would you encourage us to think about maybe?
Oh, I love the practical question. As a practical ethicist, I love that. I don't know if there's anything particularly deep about my advice, but just reflecting back to this experience of being Catholic in Charlottesville over, not just in 2017, but we like to say Charlottesville wasn't a moment, it's a movement. It's still an active movement here in the city. But as you all know, Catholics all over the country and specifically in your city are also trying to respond to profound injustices. We are in an extraordinary moment in history right now. And I think the best advice I can offer is to show up. And that, by show up, I think, yes, if you can and you're able and and for Catholics, call matters, vocation matters, and you are called through prayerful discernment to show up physically, to march with others, to march for others, to volunteer in specific instances, whether this is in offering people more information about how to get vaccinated and how this, makes sense for Catholics to do for the common good, little things like that. Showing up is so important. But I also think there's a spiritual component to the showing up. And this gets to your point, Annie, about well, this is why I didn't show up, right? Because I think, if we think not simply, but just if we kind of emphasize I need to physically go to a place in order to make an impact. We've learned over this past year that that's not always true. That is very true in some respects, and we're Catholics and we love embodiment, but there's also so much you can do from where you're sitting right now and trying to use your life of prayer and your reflection, both as individuals, but also as a parish who has a wonderful community, on what you can do, how you can show up, even if this doesn't mean you are kneeling on the pavement in the middle of, Virginia August while white supremacists run at you with their swords and shields. It's a really fascinating the kind of violence that was perpetrated. It's really weird to me in some ways, but that's not the place for everyone. But where is your place, and how do you show up to that place? I think is the best advice I can offer. And of course, thinking about those resources is something, and those opportunities is something you can do as a community in a way that is particular to you and to what the challenges your parish faces. But I think showing up is so crucial for that.
Yeah. Where is your place and how do you show up to that place? I think that's something that can be central to our prayer, right? To our individual prayer, to our communal prayer, and our ongoing discernment, right? That's essentially mission. What is your place and how do you show up to that place? Thank you for that. I want to go ahead and open it up to questions. Brian, I'm not sure if you have any questions that have been sent in the chat.
Not yet. So what I'm going to tell people that we've done in the past is, so you can put a question in the chat and I'll read it for you. You can use the hand raise feature as Taya has just done. So if you scroll down to reactions on the bottom of your screen, or participants, if you have an older version of Zoom, you can raise your hand. And if that's not working, just direct message me or put it in the chat and I'll make sure that your question gets asked. I'm going to let Annie field the questions and I'll interrupt if there's something from the chat that we haven't noticed.
Okay, so we have one hand raised. Is it Taya?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question in terms of my reaction in terms of a couple of the comments you made in terms of which parish is open, which parish is closed, and also the expectations that seem to be somehow tied to becoming more perfect, meaning more white. I mean, historically, we're part of a church that has been a colonializing church. It has been a conquistador type of church, a conquering kind of church, not one that necessarily grew organically throughout the globe, whether it was in this continent, Latin America, Europe, you name it. There are always people from, whether it's directly from Rome or the various orders, Jesuits were certainly involved in that in Asia, that the idea of converting the heathen, of bringing people into the, a more westernized kind of thought. And it seems that what you're describing is still a relic of that. And that somehow has been woven into the fabric of expectation of how the church somehow should be done. The shoulds that are the unwritten expectations or the unwritten assumptions sometimes that tie into that. And I'm wondering, your thoughts on that. And the second piece having to do with parish closures, it seems that many of the decisions were strictly financial and not pastoral. So if you're going to close a parish that generates income in a rich white suburb, let's say, you leave that one alone versus perhaps a parish in an urban area where people are less able to contribute financially. So just two different kind of question, thought, reactions in terms of your comments. Thank you.
Sure. Well, to the second point first, I think that's the narrative that's out there, is that these parishes that are being closed are largely poor ones. There's a lot of examples of ones that are either self-sustaining or income generating that have also been closed. So I think the party line has been, we're keeping, the more affluent parishes open because they can sustain us all. But what kind of sustenance is being offered there? So in Denver, for example, this parish, it was founded by Latinos in a boxcar. They paid for everything. And actually, in addition to poorer parishioners, the former mayor of Denver, who was also the Secretary of Transportation and of Energy, Federico Peña, was also a member, along with like all of his Latino lawyer friends. So this wasn't like, oh, a parish with nothing. Oh, they're here begging for white people money. They were closed and merged with a white parish that was a few blocks away, or like a half mile away, in part because they were, one of the excuses was they don't generate enough money. But they said, here's our endowment, and here's the money that we do generate, and here's what we do. So I would push back on that narrative that that's why parishes are being closed. And even if that is why some parishes are being closed, I think that, again, it doesn't take into account the value of an open Black parish, even if it needs, some additional support from the diocese, even if it needs some additional repair, that perhaps having that Black parish open and running and doing what it needs to do has a greater value than can be quantified in dollar amounts. But I think to your first point, like, yeah, that's a part of, how these things go. But I think also for again, it's maybe because of the people who I worship with now, I'm not even sure it's always necessarily a pernicious dynamic, or a pernicious intent, I should say. It is a pernicious dynamic, but a pernicious intent, like, oh, I want to, make sure that these Latinos become white. It often comes packaged with, I want to make sure they become wealthy so they can live the American dream, and therefore having them at my really wealthy, my parish just recently completely renovated. It is like, whoa, it's like if Jay-Z designed a church. It's super fancy. But like somehow it would be better for the Latinos to be in this wealthy parish than in a simple parish, because they could be more American in that way. So I'm not sure it's necessarily always like a sense of conquest, but it can be. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that is a part of the history for sure.
But isn't the perniciousness, though, kind of the unwritten culture of whether it's the parish or the church writ large that has filtered through in terms of how some of these decisions are made?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's basically if I've had an argument, that's part of the argument. Yeah.
Brian, I see you have your hand raised.
I'm torn. I've got a question in the comments that I'll ask next, but I'm going to claim privilege to ask a question myself as well, or make a comment as well. So it's really striking me in a way that's really helpful for me in this series to think through this and about where does Holy Trinity go, the complications of thinking that other parishes should be like our parish, whatever the R is, and what for me in the past and I think now is always challenging about that, and is from my Latino Catholic brothers and sisters, has been the way in which thinking about the parish you mentioned back in Charlottesville that was way Vatican II, but wasn't quite so up on necessarily race stuff or working directly in terms of Charlottesville. Like, I think we who are at a parish that prides itself on being a really Vatican II parish also have this tendency to sort of think that our way of being Catholic is better than, say, a church that has a lot of devotionals, has a lot of devotion to Guadalupe, has a lot of forms of more traditional piety, traditional praying that are different than what we like in our kind of quasi-Episcopalian Jesuit parish. So the way in which we sometimes we want everyone to be more Jesuit and have a hard time letting go of that. And yet at the same time, there's also the torn thing there of, so I'll speak for myself here. As a gay man, one of the reasons I go to the parish I go to is that it feels safer to me than a more traditional parish, whether it's primarily Latino or primarily African American or another white traditionalist parish. So I guess my question is about how to reconcile that. How do you have the conversation where you're wanting to say that our way of being church is not necessarily to be imposed on others, while also recognizing some of the ways in which it's become a haven for divorced and remarried Catholics, for single Catholics, for people in mixed marriages of various kinds, for LGBTQ plus people. That's what I'm just wrestling with here. So go, figure it out in 5 seconds.
I love the question, in part because I think part of this argument that I would make for, keeping parishes perhaps less, that don't tithe at the same level as my current parish, for example, keeping parishes that do have particular identities and that are able to embrace particular groups. Like somebody might critique me and be like, oh, you're a boutique parish kind of gal. Like, but I do think that there's a way that a parish like yours is an anchor to a community that needs to be there, that offers that kind of space. So again, I don't think, like, at least I don't want to assume anything about your parish, but the parish I was going to, it had like gotten rid of kneelers, and we held hands during the Our Father before the pandemic. Those are all fine things. But I think the more powerful work that they were doing is that they became home to our Spanish-speaking ministry in town, and that spoke a lot louder to the vision and goals of Vatican II than not kneeling. And I think that I guess I don't even know if it's a critique, but it's a possibility that churches, that are more affluent, that, at BC, I was a member of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and there was definitely a sense of, like, those of you who have been to the parish, it's a wonderful parish, but it was a different set of issues than when I ended up going to a parish in Wellesley that, you would think was more affluent, but it was a lot older, and the issues were different, and the way that solidarity was embodied and kind of lived out had to be different at that parish than at the university parish. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I do think it's a problem that when we, as a church, make decisions that are difficult about who needs to close and who needs to open, it comes down time and time again against parishes that are doing this important work. But I also think, to the other inside of your question, that parishes that are open and affirming need to continue to be that light in the world, that salt and light, if you will, to witness to other parishes, including Latino parishes that would, have really strong devotionals, but not be there in terms of being welcoming, or, even those that want to be, not knowing how to be, having that kind of witness from a parish that shows us Christ's presence in that very particular way.
Thank you. I have a question from Anik in the chat. He's going to ask it himself.
Right. So I got a question. So what is your suggestion? Suppose that, like you found your fellow Catholic and maybe, like someone who might be, like a layman or a priest, that you are either anti-racist or support white supremacists, or at very least, like insensitive, acting improperly, or like deny, like the whole racial struggle outright.
Sorry, my child was yelling in the background, so I missed the last part of your question. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that for me?
All right. Okay. So the last part is, like the person who, like either, like insensitive or, like denied about, like the whole racial struggle and problem that we're having in right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. In part because there's so many people. I don't like that language of so many, but there are members of the body of Christ in the United States who not only, are a little bit more reticent about joining a movement for racial justice or being an anti-racist parish, but actually, are actively involved with white supremacist groups. And I think one thing that we need to do as Catholics, and maybe this is, for the to-do list, the action list, is just to make it very clear, if somebody's saying something insensitive or somebody is saying something actively supporting, a white nationalist organization, that, a known one, not even like, oh, just kind of intimating that that's the case, but like somebody saying, oh, the Proud Boys aren't so bad. Well, the Proud Boys stand firmly against central Catholic values. They're not a group for us to, be sympathetic to, right? So I think that some prophecy, some prophetic positioning is called for. At the same time, I think in trying to build these relationships, and maybe again, my own parish kind of is important for my perspective on this, because I don't agree with everybody in that parish on everything, but I think the relationships are far more important to how we live our lives together than being right all the time. So yes, I think I'm right. And I think when people are being insensitive, I should say something about that. But I also think it's important to kind of listen to where they're coming from, to try to understand it better. I'm still going to disagree, 10 times out of 10 when somebody says, the Proud Boys are defending American values or, that they're not, inconsistent with Catholic values. But if I hear somebody saying something racially insensitive, having that conversation is very important. But in order to have a good conversation, you need to have a relationship first. And that can only happen if people get to know each other. So.
There's no more questions in the chat, but I think we have time for a couple more before we go. Nina's got her hand.
Yeah, Nina has her hand up.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but just to some of the points that you're making about solidarity and hopefully building community so that other parishes can call upon us. What do we do with our struggle at Holy Trinity specifically, that we are a dominantly white parish? So it's hard. I'm a woman of color, but I'm not one of many in the parish. It's hard to get to know other people who are not like you and who can easily go to Georgetown and who are Jesuit educated. I think that's very much part of the feel and the brand of Holy Trinity. And it is a haven to so many, but it's not a diaspora of different people that I would like to see. So what are some of your thoughts on how we create that solidarity with other parishes who sometimes are not interested in in us reaching out because they don't have the capacity, or they look at our history, which is imperfect, being associated with the society and Georgetown and our own parish in and of itself, having first married slaves as the first couple married in the parish. But just what are your thoughts on how it's not an overnight, there's no overnight fix, right? And there's no, one step that we can take, but do you know how we can approach that in a context of people being dominantly white? And I think understanding that racism is bad and wanting to combat it, but also having a real tough time with some self-reflection, or wrapping their arms around white privilege, that maybe it's not something you've done, but something that you need to reconcile with in terms of how you're approaching the problem. So I don't know. I feel like I threw a lot out there, but any reflections you have, I really appreciate.
It's such a great set of questions. And first of all, so Nina is my sister's name. So I love your name. I just had to say that. I think one of the instructive places for me in terms of this problem has not actually come from my experiences as a Catholic, but I'm married to a Protestant who is a member, and I guess I, by extension, am also a member of a church that is heavily white. It's a Virginia Baptist convention, but it's kind of like a high liturgy, like Baptist church. It's an interesting combination, but they're a very Charlottesville church. They were planted in Charlottesville. They're very white. They're very aware of how white they are. But one thing that I've seen them do that, again, logistically, I don't know how this looks in your archdiocese. And Charlottesville is a small town where everybody's like 1 degree of separation from each other. So it might be different in different contexts. But before the pandemic, we had not just one, but a number of sister churches with Black churches, Black Baptist churches in the area. And we would just have events where we went there. We were requiring people to come to us in the middle of Charlottesville, where, or neighborhoods where policing is a huge problem, like where a lot of our houses are, like even in my own neighborhood, like we do have Black and brown people here, but we are middle to upper class Black and brown people who look like we're not a threat here. So we don't face the same kind of police scrutiny as someone, if we invited someone from one of our neighboring brother or sister Black churches. So we would go there and worship with them, and we had like a cookout at the Black church. Like it was a country Black church actually, and it was like this sweltering August day, and we went inside this little church with no air conditioning, with inferior facilities to what we were used to, and listened to this beautiful gospel music all day and just chatted with people. And I think, there was no treatise that came out of that. And I, think it was safe to say that we're more open and affirming than our Black brother church. But it was the cornerstone of relationship. And it's a relationship that we've been able to maintain through this pandemic time, insofar as we can, because not everybody at this little country church has access to, great broadband and things like that. So this work is going to have to continue in a new way once we're able to see people again. But it was something small. And as we do that, with this Protestant church, I'm like, what prevents Catholics from doing that? Well, closing the churches where people gather. But some people might argue like, oh, integrating the churches is the way to do it. Let's go back to the old school parish model. And I think that that's one way of going about it. But I think that like all acts of solidarity, it needs to be done in the spirit of mutuality, equality, and participation. That it cannot be like, oh, I'm coming here to do something for you without, or to you, or for like, I think there's an important place for that. Like, there was a lot of people who participated in COVID testing and now special COVID vaccination clinics here in Charlottesville at Black and brown churches, both Protestant and Catholic. I think that kind of work that needs to happen, but I'm not even sure that's where the real relationship is built. So what are those little opportunities? And maybe, I don't like having your parish like run up on another parish and like everybody go hang out is not the way to do it. But what does it look to have some of you, go to 2 or 3, out into the world and, attend that parish, build those relationships. That might already be happening in some ways, but it's one way, one small way. And I also I see that we're kind of like short on time, but like in terms of imagination, I think, and especially Annie's comments, because, I didn't have in mind, oh, I'm critiquing Annie for not being here on August 17th, but I wonder, I try to imagine what would it have looked like on August 12th, 2017, even if people who couldn't have shown up here had found some way digitally or by, and they did days later after everything had happened. There were rallies all over the country, but what if that had happened before? And maybe we were in a place where we weren't imagining this, and I shouldn't be so harsh projecting back. This is coming from my own place of anger and trauma from having this happen to my community, but what would that have looked like? So I just want to encourage that imagination around it, and again, being realistic about the problems. We can't, like I said earlier, we just can't wish these away. We can't imagine that these are not issues. But in acknowledging the truth of that, there's power to respond to it in a meaningful way.
I think I'm going to take that opportunity to thank both our guests and Annie for coordinating this. To thank you. I think two things I'm taking away from this, especially, are the importance of showing up. And so, first of all, thank you for showing up today on a Sunday afternoon when it's nice out, right? So showing up is important. But I think that the second thing that Nichole just said about thinking creatively about how do we show up. I think that's where there's a lot more room for growth. We've got a lot of interesting and wonderful and smart people in our parish. I think there's also room for seeing some of what more that's already being done. So I'm going to put back into the link. If you're not on Ashley Click's social justice email, she sends out an amazing email each week with lots of the things that are happening in the parish, including Bob Stump's Restorative Justice Committee is already doing some of these, reaching out and working with other parishes in the area. Especially historically Black Catholic parishes. They're looking for people for the Social Justice Committee, right? So there's all sorts of possibilities here. The thing I would say is that we're in the beginning of a process. One of the things I was really hopeful about the series, and once again, our guests have just blown it out of the park. So thank you, is thinking about this as how do we continue having ongoing conversations about who we are, about how our theology can influence our practice better. And so we might not have any for a couple of months because summer is coming and people even less likely to show up on a Sunday afternoon, but these conversations are going to continue. And so I think that the advice to discern what your call is in the parish or outside of our parish about how are we going to be called to do this work, I think that's a really great place to end. So thank you very much to our guests. Thank you all for showing up and being there. And we'll see you all more sometime soon, either in person or on Zoom, or probably a combination of both for the next few months. Have a good rest of your Sunday afternoon.